Friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13 and 18 through 26. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man called Matthew sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he got up and followed him. And as he sat at dinner in the house, many tax collectors and sinners came and were sitting with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they said to his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" But when he heard this, he said, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have come to call not the righteous, but sinners." While he was saying these things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, for she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, he went in and took her by the hand, and the girl got up. And the report of this spread throughout the district. Well, I happen to be a child of the 60s, and, my childhood went into the early 70s, and so there's a certain style that was around then. And by the way, I actually understand that some of that style is coming back, some of that 60s style. So those of you who replaced the orange shag carpet in your houses might have done so prematurely. You could have saved it. But if you were a child of the 60s, and maybe you had this in your house, and maybe your grandparents had it in their house or something like that, if you came into our living room, this was a very 60s thing to see. The sofa with the plastic cover. Okay? All right? I don't know how many of you had that, but my mom, that was the first thing they did. They bought a house, they bought a brand new living room set, and then they immediately covered it in plastic. And you remember what that was like, that if you were like wearing shorts or something like that, you sat on it and you had to peel your thighs off the seat when you got up, okay? It was the most uncomfortable thing in the world. But there's some people who actually kind of live like that. They live with that mindset, all right? And what happens in our passage today is that Jesus is at dinner with these tax collectors. So it said that Jesus called Matthew, who was a tax collector, to be his follower. And then it says that they were at dinner in the house. They don't actually say whose house. So he said, "Matthew, follow me," and then it's not clear whether he was having dinner at Matthew's house or whether they were at one of the disciples' homes. So it's not clear where the house is, but he's there, and clearly Matthew has brought a lot of his tax collector buddies to come with him. And remember, as we've mentioned all the time, tax collectors were hated. They were considered to be traitors in the Jewish community because they were creating the funds, they were oppressing the people in order to fund the Roman Empire. And so the buddies came to dinner, and they're sitting with Jesus and his disciples, and this is offensive to observant Jews at the time who were not supposed to have dinner in the company of such awful people. You are supposed to avoid having dinner with people like tax collectors, with sinners. You were not supposed to even enter the home of a Gentile. And so he's there. And so what happens is the Pharisees are looking at this, and they go to his disciples. Now notice they don't ask Jesus what he's doing. They instead try to sow dissent by asking his disciples, why is your teacher doing this? They're trying to discredit Jesus in the eyes of Jesus' followers by saying, why is your teacher doing this? Why is your rabbi eating with tax collectors and sinners? Because their whole idea was that they were supposed to be trying to keep themselves pure. All right. So the mentality was that you need to keep yourself pure pure. And this was more important than trying to spread purity into the world. You weren't supposed to be trying to make other people pure. You were worried about keeping yourself free from the pollution of these horrible people or of horrible ideas. It was about maintaining your own purity. And Jesus responds to them by saying this, and he says, go and learn what this means. All right, and you'll notice this phrase, I desire mercy, not sacrifices, in quotes, because what Jesus is doing is he's quoting from the prophet Hosea. So he's actually quoting Hosea 6:6. So this is a quote that they would recognize. And remember, Jesus never said he was coming to overturn the law, right? He always said, I am here to fulfill the law. But what happened was he was telling people how to properly interpret the law. And so he quotes Hosea and says to them, go and learn what this means. In other words, you clearly have not understood the meaning of this verse. You need to come to a greater understanding of what this verse means. And I'm going to spend some time on this, all right? I'm going to spend some time on this because there's another great Hebrew word in here. Hebrew has these wonderful words. For example, one of the wonderful words that we know all the time, we've known for many years, right, is that word shalom, okay? So we hear that word shalom, and if you've been exposed to the word, you've been told that it has this multiplicity of meanings, that it has, it doesn't just mean peace, it means all kinds of things. It means this holistic peace, this wholeness, this completeness. There's a depth of meaning to the word shalom that goes far beyond a simple English rendition of the word like peace, all right? A few weeks ago, we talked about this word ruach, which means spirit, which is, again, this word that goes through the Hebrew scriptures and is full of depth and meaning to it. And in this verse where Jesus is quoting, he's using this word, he's quoting Hosea, who used this word hesed. And hesed is another one of these beautiful, complicated Hebrew words with a multiplicity of meanings, okay? And hesed was used in the Hebrew scriptures to describe God's love. And it embraces all of these concepts of unconditional love, of generosity, of commitment, all right? And it's not that it just means all of these things, it means all of these things at once. See, that's the beauty and complexity of the word. It's not like you have words in English that can mean this or it can mean that, and it may mean, 2 or 3 different things, all right? And that's not the case with words like shalom or hesed. They don't just mean multiple things, they mean all of those things at once. It doesn't just mean any one of those things in context. It means all of the things at the same time. And that's what makes these words very difficult to translate, all right? And so one of the things that happens that we need to understand is that when you're translating from a language with that kind of depth into a language that doesn't have a word, you end up having to pick one. And then you lose all the other meanings in the process, okay? So what happens here, and it's this quandary that you have in translation. So a simple diagram that I made to try and explain this is that, on the left in blue, remember, Jesus doesn't speak Greek. Jesus is speaking Aramaic, which is very similar to Hebrew. So he's speaking in a language that uses these beautiful words of Hebrew origin. So you have this word hesed, which can mean things like goodness and mercy and steadfast love and kindness, and it means them all at once. But then when they write down what Jesus said in the Gospels, they translate what he said into Greek. And Greek doesn't have a word that encompasses all of those definitions at once. And so what happens is when they translate the Aramaic that Jesus was speaking into the Greek, they have to take this beautiful word with multiple meanings and pick one. And so what happens is that they pick one word in Greek, all right? That's one of the things that the word means in Hebrew, but there is no Greek word that means all of the things. So there is no way to accurately translate it, all right? So they pick one, and the one they picked in our passage today is the one that means mercy. And so when we then translate the Greek into English, you get Jesus saying, learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Okay. But when you understand the context and understand that he's quoting Hosea, you understand that what Jesus said is go and learn what this means. I desire Hesed, not sacrifice. I desire Hesed, not sacrifice. And so we have to explore Hesed. And even when you look at Hosea 6:6 and you look at the different English translations of Hosea 6:6, they choose different words. Because again, in English, we don't have a word that means all these things at once. So when people translated Hosea into English from the Hebrew, they pick one of the meanings. And if you just look at a handful of different English translations of Hosea, you end up with these different choices. You'd end up with different translations that I desire mercy, I desire goodness, I desire steadfast love, I desire kindness. Okay? And the reality is that translation is not a matter of any one of those choices being better than the other choices. It's a matter of understanding that Hesed is all of them at the same time. Right? So you understand the love of God as being mercy and goodness and steadfast love and kindness. It's all of those things at once. Right? It's all of those things at once. It's so all-encompassing, okay? And that doesn't just come across with the word mercy. Mercy's not enough to describe what they're trying to say about the love of God. And then the other stories that go along with this, all right, are the stories that try and teach us what Hesed looks like in life. What does Hesed look like in your everyday life? And the first story that we see is the story of a woman who'd been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years, came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. All right? So this is the first of two stories that immediately follow this, and they're actually connected in a way that isn't necessarily obvious. All right? So the first is that this woman who is bleeding touches his clothing, all right, which may not seem significant to you because the way we look at it, all right, we look at the issue being that, oh, something happened to bring her healing. We look at the effect of touching his clothing as opposed to the way a person who is observant in Judaism would have seen this. They would have seen this as Jesus being defiled by the act of a woman with bleeding touching him, all right? Women who were suffering from bleeding were not allowed. They had to undergo a ritual cleansing before they could touch anything, okay? And so they were considered unclean. And then the second thing is very similar. It's this interspersed story. Remember, the way this thing came together was that while Jesus is having dinner with the tax collectors, a leader of the synagogue comes to him and says, my daughter's dying. Can you come help her? And then Jesus leaves dinner to go to his house, to his daughter, and on the way to dinner, this woman comes up to him and touches him, all right, and touches his clothing, all right? So after this has happened, he gets to the leader's house, and he sees these mourners who were there, who were wailing, and he says, we don't need you. Your services are not needed. By the way, the mourners were probably paid, all right? Or this is what would happen. People had paid mourners, and so they were there. And actually, the way it worked was you showed up and wailed, and expected to be paid. It's not like you went out and hired people, but rather you expected to be paid. So it'd be kind of a really weird thing to have people who would like hang out at a funeral home and just show up at someone's funeral, so there'd be extra people there, and kind of expect a tip on the way out the door from the survivors. But this is kind of how it worked, all right? So they show up to do the performative wailing, the performative mourning, and Jesus says, go away. Your services are not needed. You're not going to actually get paid today, so you might as well just go home, all right? Because the girl is sleeping, and that's why they laughed. In other words, if they were truly, genuinely mourning, it would not be a reasonable response to laugh. Okay, if you were actually in mourning, you would be happy if someone said the person you're mourning is not actually dead. All right, I mean, that would be the best news possible. And so that's the indicator that these were not sincere mourners, but they were paid mourners, because they laughed when Jesus said the girl was okay. All right. And so what happens is that he goes in, and even though he says they're sleeping, the reality was that they had said the girl had died, and so what Jesus has done is touched a corpse. The girl is dead, and he's touched a corpse, and this would render him unclean. Okay. We see this show up in other stories. If you remember stories like the parable of the Good Samaritan, and the man is lying in the road, and it says that the priest walked to the other side, all right? It was because the priest is on his way to the temple to do his priestly duties. And if he checked on the guy, by just like touching him to see, hey, buddy, are you alive? And it turned out the guy was dead, he would be ritually defiled and not able to participate in his duties as a priest for a period of time, okay? And so that's why he cuts what might be a body a wide berth, so that he doesn't risk accidentally touching a corpse and disqualifying himself from doing his duty in the temple, all right? So that's one of the reasons why you see the priest walking around what might be a dead person rather than checking. All right. It's a very similar mindset to this in terms of saying, I have to worry about my own purity rather than the possibility of helping the person who is in the road. So you see this theme that shows up in a lot of Jesus' teachings. So he touches this corpse, which is also not okay. And so what all three incidents have in common, the thread that runs through this story, is three things that make Jesus unclean. He's eating with tax collectors, he's touched by a woman with hemorrhages, and he touches a corpse. And so all of these things render Jesus unclean, unfit in the eyes of the religious establishment, and Jesus doesn't care. He wasn't interested in protecting himself from these potentially unclean situations. All right? Protection was not the goal. The focus was on the good that could be done. So it's in that context that what you hear Jesus saying is something that I think is really important in our day, when he says, look, those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. Now, this is one of the things that I've always known as a sideline of how healthcare professionals have a really heightened level of devotion. We saw it during COVID. Right? They were going to work. They had a 7 times greater chance of contracting COVID than the rest of the population. Because no matter what they wore, the amount of PPE they put on, all this stuff, all right, they were going in to treat patients who were sick. All right? You couldn't have a physician at that time who would say, I will only see patients who aren't sick. If you're not sick, come to my office, but if you are sick, stay away because I'm afraid of getting COVID. All right? That wouldn't work. All right? Healthcare professionals, doctors, nurses, aides are continually going into situations where they are potentially exposed to illnesses. They're not reckless. I mean, they take the precautions they can, but they're willing to take the risk because people need healing. So they're willing to do what they have to do in order to bring healing to people. The priority is the healing over the self-protection. And at the end of the day, this is the essence of what Hesed is in life. If you look up the word and you read commentaries from Jewish scholars about what Hesed means, what all of them focus on is the idea that Hesed is always a loving action toward others. Hesed is always about the other person. When Jesus says, learn what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, I desire Hesed and not sacrifice. See, many people think that I'm okay if I turn my focus, my love, my attention toward God, all right? And that was the attitude of the Pharisees. That was the attitude of the religious establishment. You need to turn your attention to God. You need to worship God. You need to bring your offerings to God, all right? And it's not so important to put your attention on the people. And what Jesus was showing them and teaching them was that action to God is action to people, and action to people is action to God. It's not like they are in two separate directions. It's not like you're sitting here in life and saying, I can either turn my love and attention toward God or turn it toward people. They're not in opposite places. They're the same. Right? You love God and you love the people. They're in the same direction. Action to God is action toward people. Hesed is loving action toward others. And so this call to Hesed is a call, a reminder of our duty to engage problems rather than shield ourselves from them. Right? Shielding ourselves puts ourselves first. It says, I'm going to shield myself. I'm going to live in a bubble. I'm going to try and keep the problems of the world, the problems of others away from me. I'm going to try and keep them from infecting me. I'm going to keep myself safe. I'm going to keep myself pure. But if you're going to put others first, if you're going to show love toward others, then you have to engage the problems. It's not enough to shield yourself from them, and it's not enough to simply not be a part of the problem. But rather, we have to engage the problem, because you know what? Problems don't solve themselves. Personal problems don't solve themselves. Relational problems don't solve themselves, and societal problems don't solve themselves. No problem gets better when you ignore it. No matter what level it happens at, no matter how difficult it may seem to engage the problem, we have a duty to engage the problem. We have a duty to engage the problem because that's the essence of Hesed, is that I'm going to take loving action toward others. I'm going to take loving action to solve problems that are around me. I'm going to take loving action to solve personal problems, loving action to solve relational problems, and loving action to solve societal problems. We can't go through life with that sofa cover on. Right? It keeps the sofa clean. It does not provide comfort. Right? You take the cover off. You risk the stains. But in so doing, you bring comfort to the world. So let's take the covers off of our lives and engage, even at the risk that we'll get dirty in the process. Amen.